This is Learn from Others, where we interview a cross-section of successful individuals so you can learn from their experiences, achievements, and even their mistakes. We ask 4 questions that will educate and inspire. Greg Stanley will be your guide as we join our guest on a journey from adolescent daydreaming to success in today's world. Join us on this adventure as we learn from others together.
Welcome to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest today, Brian Gill. Brian, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I appreciate you taking us on your career journey, but before we find out what you're actually doing today, if you would, could you please tell me, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I was really into computers at a very, very young age, and I always knew I'd be doing something with computers. So I never really thought I'd be an astronaut or a football player or anything. I was definitely on the very nerdiest end of the spectrum, and I thought I would be doing something like Bill Gates.
Wow. Aspirational goals at a young age.
Yeah, or just, I definitely wanted, even at a young age, I wanted to run a company someday. And, it's hard to, my parents have asked me like, hey, why did you want to do all that? Or where did that come from? Because, my parents, they worked really, really hard for more traditional companies their whole careers. And I have no idea, but ever since I was like 8, 9 years old, like I wanted to build a business, and I was interested in money and capitalism and computers. And, I knew pretty early that I wanted to do this stuff.
Okay, we kind of alluded to it. So tell us, are you today another version of Bill Gates?
I think I have approximately a 10,000th or 100,000th of his success, but I'm definitely a successful person, and I've had a great career, and probably been luckier or fortunate than most, and I've had a ton of great experiences. So I'm my version of Bill Gates, I guess.
Yeah. So tell us, what do you do today?
Well, today, in late or early 2020, I'm CEO of a company called Gillware Incorporated, and Gillware does a lot of stuff, but the stuff that we do here at Gillware Inc. is we do what's called data recovery. So anytime a person or a business loses data, they're in some sort of data-related disaster, and the backups are not there, they basically reach out to us to try to get them that data back.
Wow. Okay. Now, if you would, tell us, how did you go from wanting to be Bill Gates when you were young to today? Like, what was your career path, educational path? Kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, so I graduated high school and applied to one college because I always knew I wanted to be a Badger, and I got accepted to the University of Wisconsin-Madison here, and thought, I was kind of an idiot, and I basically just went to the engineering school and looked at what the graduates were making, because again, I just wanted to make money. I wanted to make as much money as I could. And electrical engineers, coming out of school at the time back, 20 some years ago, were making like 60 grand a year out of school. I was like, oh my gosh, that's an enormous amount of money back then.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I decided to be an electrical engineer, and absolutely hated the curriculum, hated the circuitry. Luckily for me, my sophomore year, I had an internship where I went to a big telecommunications company and basically was working on a large telecom project and laying out chips and writing code to diagnose what's going on, and hated everything about it. And it was the best thing that ever happened. I mean, I was good at it, but I did not. Every day I'd roll out of bed and have to drive to that place and it was just not for me. And then my classes, I was getting like C's, which for me, my whole life, I just kind of accidentally got A's for I never really had to learn how to study. I pretty much just skated through high school and skated through the first couple of years of college. And, I bumped into these electrical engineering courses, and not only did I not quite know how to study, but I also had never really had to be motivated to study. And it led to me getting like C's and like being in like the bottom half of the class. And I was surrounded by all these young people that wanted to be electrical engineers, that were just as smart as me, who were motivated and probably knew how to study. And I was just getting my teeth kicked in. And eventually that internship let me come back to school, and I sat down and I had a similar conversation about my background. He's like, why aren't you in the computer science program? And I'm like, oh yeah, that probably makes a lot more sense. So my junior year, I switched to computer science and, back on track, got a bunch of A's and graduated. And at the time, that was like it was coming up on Y2K. For personal reasons, I decided to stick around Wisconsin for a year and took a job there's not a lot of big tech software places in Wisconsin at the time. And, now there's Facebook and Google, and there's all kinds of cool companies here where you could be a programmer right here in Madison. But at the time, almost everybody was going out to California, and all the people that were recruiting us, or all the companies that were recruiting us, were like Microsoft, Oracle, and places like that. And you basically had to buy a plane ticket and go out there. So I didn't want to do that because of, again, some personal stuff, and decided to stick around and took a job at the next best thing for me, which was a mutual fund company.
Okay.
Because, I've always been interested in the stock market and capitalism and companies and, IPOs and all that stuff. And I basically, unfortunately, it was doing in the early days a bunch of like Y2K programming, but it was really cool. And the company I worked for is gone now, but it was called Strong Mutual Funds. And they were one of the first companies, if not the first company, to allow like mutual fund trading on their website. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty old, so it was like, but it was a big deal back then. Like before that, if you wanted to trade a mutual fund, you had to like call a broker, So I got some exposure to the early web stuff and some of those early programming languages and some of the early web servers, and then basically was freed up from some of my personal obligations, quit that job after about a year, bought a one-way plane ticket out to Silicon Valley, and literally also was an idiot. So one of the common themes to my story is I'm kind of an idiot, or I'm pretty impulsive, and I basically bought a one-way ticket, packed like a duffel bag, and got on a plane and landed in SFO and thought I was in San Francisco.
You're right.
And
I see where this is going.
I drove about 2 miles and I saw, hey, this place I rented a car at the airport. So I was driving a Ford Focus, and I made about 2 miles from the airport and saw that this place had an apartment for rent, and it was a Friday about 4:00, and I walked in and I'm like, hey, let me see the place. I saw it, and boy, it was expensive. It was like $1,800 a month.
Wow.
Like,
okay.
Well, I heard it was expensive to live out there. And I'm like, all right, whatever. So, and then they're like, I'm like, when can I move in? And they're like, what? I'm like, because they're not used to people just like showing up with a duffel bag saying like, let me sign a
right
lease. So again, I figured why be in a hotel or whatever. So I signed the lease and I got the keys and moved right in, and then realized I was actually, maybe 25 miles south of the city, and, maybe 45 miles north of like San Jose. So it was a really dumb decision. And didn't have a job, went and basically, one would think if you had thought this through, you would have done a little bit more planning, but it was a hot market and I knew it wouldn't take me long to find a job, and ended up bouncing around at a couple different startups, and most of them exploded spectacularly.
In a bad way or a good way?
Bad way. Well, yeah,
Okay.
I mean, one of the first places I worked at is called Nextag, and they're still around. But the longest tenure I had out there was at a company called iSharp, and I actually got to experience like the classic, Silicon Valley startup experience, kind of, I guess. I was maybe the third programmer that they had there. And I was probably employee 15, give or take, and we got like a big round of funding, and then got like another big round of funding, and had customers, and that company we simulated user traffic for other companies for the web.
Okay.
This is before AWS, and you could push a couple buttons and have a fast website that could service 1 million people, right? This was in the era where people were making websites and then they were spending $250,000 on a Super Bowl ad, and then those websites would crash because nobody had figured out all this scalable stuff, and there's none of this out-of-the-box product stuff to make a website scalable. So when companies were getting ready for a big push, we wrote a bunch of code that let us legitimately simulate those users. So click that link there, wait 5 or 6 seconds, maybe add some stuff to a shopping cart, maybe add a credit card number, all the stuff that users would do at the same like ratios that normal people would do it. So, if they would tell us like 7% of the people that come to this page convert into customers, that's what our users would do.
Right.
And we would simulate them from all over the world and show them like, you're really slow here, really fast here, big challenge.
Right.
So it was a cool company. We had customers, had revenue, got a bunch of funds raised. Fast forward about 20 months, and we had about 170 employees.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so we went through some dramatic growth. And then the NASDAQ crashed about 2,000 or 3,000 points. And turns out venture capitalists, they can kind of take these backsies on you.
Right. Right. So they funded and then they withdrew some funding at that time?
They basically agreed to give us, and I don't remember the number, but it was like $30 million or something. But it was in tranches, right? It was $30 million, but we'll give you like $1.5 million every month or something like that for 18 months. And about 3 or 4 months into that deal, the NASDAQ did what it did, and they basically had the right to say, oh, just kidding, and turn off the spigot. And they obviously wouldn't invest in all the stock that they would have invested in. Right. But it didn't really matter because once they pulled their funding, it was worth, zero. So right. So yeah, we basically it was all guns blazing, and then the stock market had a little hiccup, and then our CEO got everyone together and said, we're done. And I was like, what? What do you mean we're done? There's no scaling back. There was no, hey, we're going to cut half the staff. There was, it was like, hey, we lost our funding and we're done. Right.
Yeah. And yeah, if I could, let me just kind of recap a little bit because it's quite an interesting career path so far. So you wanted to be, big in the computer world at some point, like at Bill Gates when you were young. You went to college, took your first little detour to become an electrical engineer, quickly realized you did not care for that, correct?
Correct.
And then it sounded like an internship was really valuable for you. So I always tell folks an internship is great because it can either tell you're going down the wrong path or you're going down the right path.
It's a win-win,
Right.
I had another internship after that was in the computer science world, in computer programming. I absolutely loved it. And when I went back to school for the last couple semesters after that one, that's when I was like,
this is it.
Ultra motivation, 4.0s across the board. I was like peak academia at that, after that. And it was that real world experience that gave me that drive.
Now, at what point were you like off on your own as a computer scientist or starting your own business?
Yeah, so when the whole thing exploded, I hung around for about a year, and it turned out that most of the people that I respected who had played this game before told me, hey, it's going to be like 6 or 7 years before it gets back to what it was, and there's going to be startups and funding, and it's going to be a mess. And I didn't move out to California to work at a bank, which is I was working at like a big investment bank as a programmer or software architect type guy. And I'm like, I was making a good living and I was employed, but it wasn't why I moved out there.
Right.
I basically decided to move back to Wisconsin and was screwing around doing some consulting work at some companies. And it was, again, I was making good money, but like next to zero personal satisfaction or fulfillment. And that's when myself and my brother Tyler, who was actually going to school at the time at UW for computer science, decided we got to do something. And we kicked around a whole bunch of ideas, and we started talking about how he had lost, about a year before that, he had a hard drive in his computer crash, and it had all his photos from his high school years, including some of his friends that were no longer with us. And he was really, kicking himself for not, making a backup of all that data, of course.
Right.
But he wanted a solution. And, he's like, well, there's got to be somebody that fixes these things and gets me my stuff. And it took him a couple of weeks to find like 2 companies that did it, and both of them quoted him like $5,000, which at the time was like a full year of tuition at UW.
Oh, wow.
So this was not in the cards for him, you know. So, but we started talking about that, and it's like, well, how hard could that be? And well, it turns out it's pretty hard, but again, I'm impulsive, so we decided to start screwing around, and we started basically acquiring large amounts of dead storage, which dead storage isn't worth very much. So you can buy it for pennies on the dollar, mostly for like aluminum scrap, right?
Right.
And but we figured we'll just buy a bunch of this defunct equipment and see how hard it is to fix it. And it turned out it was pretty hard, but we could do it a little bit. You know, we could get maybe half, maybe 40% of them. And that was just between all my buddies from school. So one of the best things that happened to me at University of Wisconsin is all the people I met in those labs and in those extracurricular activities. I was in the marching band, and one of my buddies from the marching band is a genius, bona fide genius. He was a good friend of mine, and he was finishing up his PhD in nuclear engineering. And I was, you know, hey, how could you help us figure out how to fix these broken hard drives? He's like, well, that'll be easy, because again, he's a genius. And he had a big electrical engineering background himself before he went nuclear. And I had the computer science background. My brother Wesley was a mechanical engineer by trade at the time, and I also went to UW. So just in my circle of friends, we had all of the educational backgrounds that went into building this equipment. So we kind of naturally had all the skills to troubleshoot it, and we did. So we started the company. So once we figured out we could do it, I made our first website, because I had that background in e-commerce, so I could make a website with a shopping cart for the service and explain it. And I had enough background in marketing, because one of the companies I worked for was a big e-commerce marketing platform. So I knew how to get web pages kind of ranking on stuff before that was like a field you could go into. And people started shipping it to us. And we were working out of my basement, just like the 3 of us at the time. After about 4 months, we were getting like 20 hard drives were getting shipped to us every day.
Wow. Okay.
And it was like, all of a sudden it's like, hey, I could make a living doing this. And pretty shortly thereafter, we went out and like rented an office and hired like people to answer phones. And, my brother Tyler ended up dropping out of college, which I don't recommend, especially to your audience, but he did the math, and to him at the time, he's like, hey, I can always go back to school. He knew that there was a chance that this thing deserved his focus. And he was right. So, after another couple of years, we had like 35 employees, and it was like a real company and everything.
So now how big are you now, and what is your typical work week like?
Well, it's changed throughout the years. So maybe 4 years ago, back in like 2016, we sold our first Gillware company. So we had started a cloud services company we wrote a bunch of code to do data backup and all the servers and all the cloud infrastructure. And we ended up selling that to a company called StorageCraft out in Draper, Utah. And then at the same time, we started a digital forensics and incident response company to help people respond to ransomware events. And that company, between the 2 companies that were active, we had about 55 employees, 60 employees. But that digital forensics company just rebranded to a company called Tetra Defense. We took a Series A venture capital round, and basically about 30 of my best friends just all got a new office and moved out. And I'm really, it's like the little baby left the nest, and that is always really, really hard.
Right.
It's super exciting, and you should be pumped up about it. And I am, but there's the reality of going to work and not seeing the shining faces of the people that we built this thing with the last 4 years. And, sometimes when you have these moments of success, they're pretty bittersweet, at least for me.
Right. Okay. Well, how do you spend your days?
So I probably spend about a third of my days working with clients, writing statements of work for complicated data-related disasters to clearly articulate to these large companies what it is we'll do for them and what we won't be doing and what it's going to cost. So I spend about a third of my day on conference calls and doing paperwork. I spend about a quarter of my day doing stand-ups with our digital marketing group and talking with our website people and talking with our Facebook ads group and still, because I really enjoy the e-commerce stuff myself. Maybe 10 or 15% of my time with a little bit of oversight on our engineering group, making sure they didn't forget how to fix storage equipment and all those types of things.
Right.
And then 25-ish% of my time just doing kind of the boring businessy stuff with payrolls and accountants and all the, taxes and, just all the financial planning that you need to do or you're going to hit a iceberg at some point. All the really, again, it's not the fun part of business for me, but you have to pay attention to all that. You can't overextend the business or make big mistakes. Turns out if you miss a payroll, people get real mad at you. So I definitely never want to do that to anybody. And just, a good walking around. I probably spend about a couple hours every day just on one-on-one meetings with various staff members about whatever they're going through, trying to mentor, trying to lead a little bit, trying to add a little bit of value to their careers.
Okay, that sounds good. As a reminder, you can check out all previous episodes at learnfromothers.org. And if you're an educator or student, you can search for Podcast by Career Cluster. So, Brian, we learned what you wanted to be when you grew up, which was Bill Gates, and what you're doing today, which is a version of Bill Gates. So looking back on your career, what would you do differently?
That's a really hard question. I've had a ton of success, the financial success and the leadership that I didn't think I would be any good at. It turns out I really, really enjoy it. And every decision we made, they weren't all perfect, but I learned from all those mistakes and all the people, all my peers and all my friends, we all learned together from all those mistakes. So it's a little cliche, but I wouldn't change really anything. The only thing that, from the educational perspective, I definitely, like my freshman year of college, I was working I would work nights at like a candy factory doing like janitorial work. I would have probably encouraged myself to get into some internships and co-ops earlier. And I would also have encouraged my younger self to not rely so much on the curriculum of the school. For computer scientists out there, you shouldn't need a professor to learn a programming language. And frankly, some of the best programmers I've ever met, some of the best software architects I ever met, came out of school with like geology degrees. But right now, you can go to like Stanford's computer science program and all their lessons, all their plans, all their programming projects, they're just up there. You don't, and by the way, most of their lectures are on YouTube and stuff like that. Like, you don't even need, if you were to, and some of the best programmers I've ever met, this is what they did. Like, before they even got into that freshman year at school, they were taking a lot of that Stanford curriculum. College is awesome. And for me, the most critical thing that happened in college was the people I met on all those projects and all those extracurriculars. So I wish I would have done I did a lot of extracurriculars, but I wish I would have done even more. I did a couple internships. I wish I would have done 4 or 5 of them. And I guess I was in a big rush to get out of college too.
Right.
And
right.
I felt a lot of pressure to graduate and make money. And, I wish I would have taken 12 or 13 credits and just had a little bit more well-rounded life and really had enjoyed it a little more, and didn't feel all that anxiety of taking 18 credits some semesters. But as far as in general, try a bunch of stuff and find something that gives you energy, that I enjoy going to this class. I can't wait to get to this class. I can't wait to work on this project. I can't wait to write this paper, because if you find yourself like I was, where you were dreading getting to that class and you were even skipping it occasionally, you're probably in the wrong niche.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, now you kind of spoke to it already. Maybe it's just a matter of saying it a little bit differently, but let's talk to the student who wants to do what you do, to be a computer scientist or an entrepreneur. What advice would you give them?
Concentrate more on some of the best entrepreneurs, they came out of those scientific backgrounds. I learned the business stuff and I learned the leadership stuff. I think that is stuff that you can learn on your own. And they don't teach a lot of leadership stuff at school anyway. So having that strong background in some field is going to really give you a leg up when you go out to take your own entrepreneurial journey versus somebody that just went to the business school and just understands the finances side of things. Find when you're in school, again, like Greg Pfeiffer, the guy that I started a bunch of businesses with, one of those businesses has raised over $350 million of venture capital. And Greg Pfeiffer is a name that if anybody listens to this like 5 years from now, he's going to be well known in the world as like a legitimate billionaire. And I met him in marching band at UW. We were in the marching band together. You're not just going to school for your curriculum, right? You're going to hopefully meet your own 5 or 10 best friends that are going to be with you, not just in school, but maybe they're in that same entrepreneurial journey with you someday. And don't lose sight of that. Those group projects, lead them,
Right.
Lead those group projects and have fun. You got to have fun with everything that you do,
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Now, are there any projects you're working on that you would like to share?
I just really wanted to come on today, Greg, to try to add some value to your audience and talk a little bit about my journey. I'm not really here to push any particular products, but if any message to the students out there, back your data up, find that $50 a year to buy that automated cloud backup that's going to put all your stuff, implement 2-factor authentication on that backup. So if you ever get assaulted on the internet from a bad guy, that they can't get into your cloud backup and delete everything. Because again, we live in a very dangerous world right now on the cyber side of things. It's as bad as ever, and it's not just big businesses and cities that are getting targeted by these cyber criminals, but you might click the wrong link or download the wrong piece of software or try to pirate a piece of software. And it turns out, that piece of software you downloaded is pirated, but they also installed a bunch of backdoors to completely screw up your computer and encrypt all your data. So be very, very careful with your kind of internet hygiene. Back all your data up. Get a VPN service for your cell phone. And lock down your credit scores.
Yes, I did that. Yeah.
Every human, and again, students probably don't even know what the credit bureaus are, but it's free. Everybody should do it, especially students. You might as well do it now.
Right. No, that's really, really great advice. Well, what's the best way for our listeners to learn more about you and your company?
Yeah, if anybody wanted to reach out, connect with me, probably LinkedIn is probably my social media choice. So just look for Brian Gill, Gillware for LinkedIn. Just go ahead to connect with me. I connect with just about everybody. Not everybody, but certainly, computer scientists out there that wanted to bend my ear about something, had a question for me. Go ahead, connect. Be a pleasure of mine to connect with you as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking us on your career journey today.
No problem, Greg. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. Where will our next adventure take us? Subscribe to find out. If you know of someone who has a cool career story or occupation, contact Greg through Instagram at Greg Stanley LFO. That's GregStanley LFO. And we will see you soon as we learn from others together.